Every civilization on Earth has a flood story. The Sumerians, the Babylonians, the Greeks, the Hindus, the Mayans, the indigenous peoples of Australia, of North America, of sub-Saharan Africa. A catastrophic flood, a single survivor, or a small group, warned in advance. A remnant preserved to restart humanity. The same story, everywhere. Across cultures separated by oceans and thousands of years. This is not coincidence. This is memory. But here is the question that Genesis doesn't fully answer. The question that only the Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, and the ancient Sumerian texts dare to address directly. Why? What specifically happened that required the destruction of almost everything? The answer is stranger and more specific than anything you were taught. Genesis 6-5. The Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. Generic, vague, wickedness. Evil. We've been reading this as a moral failure. Humanity simply became too sinful, so God hit the reset button. But there are problems with this reading. Humanity has always been sinful. God does not flood the earth every generation. What happened in the time of Noah was different in kind, not just in degree. And look at what immediately precedes this verse. Genesis 6:1-4. The sons of God taking human wives, the nephilim. This is not coincidence of placement. This is the author of Genesis telling you that the wickedness of verse 5 is causally connected to the events of verses 1-4. The Book of Enoch makes this connection explicit. The flood was not a punishment for ordinary human sinfulness. It was a targeted response to a specific contamination of the created order. The Book of Enoch, chapter 7, describes what the nephilim, the offspring of the Watchers and human women, actually did to the world. They began by devouring all the acquisitions of men, the crops, the livestock, everything humanity had built and grown. When the food ran out, they turned on the animals, consumed them entirely, and then, and the text is explicit here, they turned to eating human flesh and to drinking blood. This is not metaphor. The ancient writers are describing a literal ecological catastrophe. Beings of enormous size and insatiable appetite consuming the resources of the earth faster than they could be replenished. A biological crisis compounded by supernatural violence. Chapter 7 ends with this line, "And the earth laid accusation against the lawless ones. The earth itself cried out." This language appears throughout the ancient Near Eastern literature. When innocent blood is shed, when violence reaches a certain threshold, the created order itself calls for judgment. But it was not just the violence and the consumption. There was something more fundamental at stake. The oldest Jewish commentaries on the flood, preserved in texts like the Book of Jubilees and the writings found at Qumran, point to something that modern readers find even more disturbing than the violence, the corruption of the human bloodline itself. The Watchers crossed a boundary that was not meant to be crossed. The mixing of divine and human nature produced offspring that were something neither human nor divine, the Nephilim. And then the text in Genesis makes a statement that most translations obscure. Genesis 6:9 says Noah was perfect in his generations. In Hebrew, tamim bidorotav, tamim, perfect, complete, without blemish. This word is used elsewhere in the Torah specifically to describe animals suitable for sacrifice, animals without physical defect, without contamination. The ancient commentaries are explicit. Noah and his family were preserved not only because of their moral character, but because their genetic lineage had not been corrupted by the mixing with the Nephilim. The flood was not a moral cleansing. It was a biological reset. the preservation of an uncorrupted human lineage through which the created order could be restored. This interpretation is disturbing. It is supposed to be. It raises questions about what humanity actually is and what was at stake in the angelic rebellion. Here is where the story becomes undeniable. The Sumerian King List, one of the oldest historical documents in human existence, written in cuneiform on clay tablets thousands of years before Genesis, records something remarkable. Before the flood, it says, kings ruled for extraordinary lengths of time, tens of thousands of years, numbers that seem impossible. And then, the flood swept over the earth. And after the flood, the king's lifespans dropped dramatically to hundreds of years, then to decades. The Epic of Gilgamesh, written centuries before Genesis in its current form, contains a flood narrative so parallel to Noah's story that 19th-century scholars who first translated it were accused of blasphemy for publishing it. A man warned by a god, a boat, animals, a flood, a resting on a mountain, a bird sent out, a covenant afterward. The same story, told by a completely different civilization, with no plausible mechanism for borrowing, and the Sumerians had their own version of the Watchers. The Anunnaki, gods who descended from the sky, who interacted with humanity, who taught forbidden knowledge, whose interactions with human women produced hybrid offspring. Different names, same story. At a certain point, the convergence of independent traditions stops being coincidence and becomes evidence. The ancient world remembered something that happened, something that required a flood to address, something that was systematically erased from the official records of every civilization that came after. The flood happened. The evidence, geological, archaeological, mythological, is overwhelming. The question has always been why, and the answer, preserved across dozens of independent ancient traditions, is consistent. Something happened to the created order in the pre-flood world that was so fundamental, so irreversible, that only a reset could address it. The mixing of the divine and human, the corruption of bloodlines, the systematic destruction of the earth's resources by beings that should not have existed. Noah was preserved because his lineage was uncorrupted. The world was flooded to remove what could not be removed any other way. But here is the final question, the one that the Book of Enoch raises and leaves deliberately unanswered. The text says, "The spirits of the nephilim, their spirits, not their bodies, which were destroyed in the flood, continued to roam the earth after the waters receded." We will come back to that. Subscribe.